Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org. Edina Eye Physicians and Surgeons, a division of Twin Cities Eye Consultants, has proudly served the Twin Cities for more than 55 years now in 7 convenient locations. Using the most advanced technology combined with human touch, Edina Eye offers comprehensive services and dedicated specialists committed to excellence with innovative procedures and expertise for the most advanced eye care.
Welcome to Access to Democracy. Alan Miller with you as host, and as we have been for the last 23 years, and we have a first-time guest. Happy to welcome Rabbi Debra Rappaport, who is co-chair of the Minnesota Rabbinical Association. So what does that entail?
Thank you for the welcome. Glad to be here. The Minnesota Rabbinical Association is the professional association for all the rabbis of Minnesota. We have 46 members in name. Some of them are retired. I think 2 are, one's in Rochester and one's in Duluth, and the vast majority are in the metro area. And we come together and concern ourselves with community events and have a supportive, mutually supportive collegial relationship, and occasionally make statements in response to some of the things happening in the world that we want to bring a moral voice to.
There are so many frightening things happening in the world right now that I'm not sure that we want to bring ourselves to discuss them, but we should. And we will, unfortunately. One of the things I really wanted to talk about with you is burgeoning anti-Semitism, not only in this country, but throughout the world. Mm-hmm. And I've been around long enough to have experienced it in several different phases, but it just seems to be growing at the moment to a frightening degree. And I know your background is such that you worked a lot with adults primarily. So
and kids, for sure.
And kids, for sure.
Yeah. But yeah, we've done a lot of adult learning.
Yeah. What is the Rabbinical Association doing at the moment, or is it, to combat this growing anti-Semitism and the acts of violence that we have seen?
What a great question, Alan, seriously. I don't know if you're familiar with the Hartman Institute, Shalom Hartman Institute in Israel, but they have scholars who are concerned about issues of support for Israel as well as for anti-Semitism in the world. And one of the things that they raised recently is that anytime you use the word anti-Semitism, accuse anyone of anti-Semitism, it puts people's hackles up and shuts down conversation. And at the same time, we have to call it out where it's taking place. And so some of what we need to be doing is defining what anti-Semitism is and what it looks like.
Well, we topicked today's conversation with you as religious bigotry or prejudice. Mm-hmm. So why don't you get into that discussion as to the anti-Semitism? Of course, there's a lot of anti-Israel factions also, as well as.
Yeah. So there's a handful of clusters, I think, of things that are going on. One is the increase in white nationalism that is all about white supremacy, and it may not seem at its face related to anti-Semitism, but it very much is, because in the white nationalist worldview, Jews are the puppet masters of the whole thing that includes, the groups that put them off, people of color and immigrants and gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans people. And so all of those prejudices that are being enacted may not directly be about the Jews at this point, but the anti-Semitism is at the heart of it.
It's a label that they slap on it, though.
What do you mean? That
I mean that all these prejudices, which people don't recognize, that in 50 years, this country is going to be an amalgam of all the ethnic backgrounds and all the ethnic people that we have in it. But they have this tendency to want to hang on to, as you said, white nationalism, the white race. And, race comes up really as a really strange designation. For instance, somebody as liberal as Whoopi Goldberg, terribly uninformed, talked about Jews and didn't recognize Jews as a race per se, and yet Hitler was determined to get rid of the Jewish race. And we face that today.
Yes, absolutely. And in the white nationalist mindset, the Jews are also a race. But just to give you some current event examples of the Pittsburgh shooting, the horrific breaking into the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh a couple of years ago, it was because they were supporting immigrants. It was a Hebrew HIAS, Immigrant Aid Society, weekend, Shabbat, at that synagogue. And so it was taking down the Jews and the immigrants, because the Jews are are supporting the immigrants. Same thing with this hostage situation in
Colleyville, Texas.
In Texas, exactly.
You're looking at my notes.
Oh, no, I'm not. If only I could read that. But they wanted to talk to the chief rabbi, for a hostage situation that's not even in America. So there's
Chief rabbi in New York, from Colleyville, Texas.
Right.
Right.
But they didn't know that. They thought it was nearby. They thought they were at the closest synagogue. And so there's this underlying assumption that all the Jews know each other, and all the Jews are in conspiracy with one another. And so there's fear-based dog whistles going on and this is all related to the forgery, ridiculous but frightening protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was at the heart of the Nazi propaganda and never really went away.
I was going to say, it still surfaces today.
All the time. It's one of the most sold books. And there's these themes of the Jews having a conspiracy theory to take over the world. So
or drinking the blood of children or whatever.
That's more medieval, but yes.
Yeah. I mean,
that's the blood libel, in my understanding, that's connected with murdering Jesus, and it's very religious anti-Semitism. The 20th century was more racial anti-Semitism and ethnic, and they all blend together, and it's, I think, important for us to recognize when some of these assumptions are being called out. So Israel, or were you going to say something else?
No.
Okay.
No.
really interesting things going on around Israel and and accusations of anti-Semitism right now. A couple weeks ago, Amnesty International, you may be aware, put out a report saying that Israel's an is an apartheid regime.
Right.
Really problematic. On the one hand, they're the third human rights organization that has said that in the past year. But they don't take into account the complexities of Israel's life on the ground.
Which is, goes far back beyond 1948. It goes far back to when all the Jews were thrown out of their Palestinian homes, and then they say, well, the Palestinians were thrown out of their Jewish homes. And I have to tell you that I believe in the two-state solution. I don't think that we will ever live to see it, but I think that there's a lot that the Israeli government has done wrong in terms of the West Bank and its treatment of the Palestinian people.
I completely agree.
They have to answer for that.
I completely agree with you. So criticism of Israel's human rights transgressions is not anti-Semitism. Wholesale condemnation of Israel as an apartheid state that is, first of all, that's a race-based definition, which brings us, again, back to it. But, it's super complicated.
Well, not only that, but there are Arabs who are members of the Knesset.
Exactly. It is a democracy.
There are hundreds of thousands of Arabs who live peacefully within the confines of Israel.
Exactly. So the critique applies to the occupied territories. And what it doesn't take into account is a couple of things. One being that Jews were among the indigenous people of the land since long before there was a Palestinian anything. And perhaps even more significantly,
long before there was a Christian religion, really.
Or Muslim, yes.
Yes.
Exactly. So they are indigenous people in that land and have been praying for a return to that land for all the 2,000 years since they left. So, it's not a colonialist undertaking as many people imply. It's just not. That just doesn't make sense in this case. But the formation of Israel as a state in the aftermath of the Holocaust also addressed an enormous human rights, like a solution to an enormous human rights issue. So if they're talking about human rights, to not acknowledge that context, and the context that as soon as Israel was established, Jews were expelled or persecuted, or maybe not in all of them, but many, many Muslim nations around the region, so that they had to come for sanctuary to the state of Israel. So it's not a perfect country, and of course it's okay to criticize it like we criticize our own government, and that's part of free speech. But the double standard does push on anti-Semitism. And one of the things that one of the Hartman scholars lifted up is, are you in relationship where you're having a rebuke with somebody that you have, you care about their welfare, or are you defaming them? Are you, and one is really appropriate and the other is not. And this really was defamation. This was not, we care about this country, we take seriously its security concerns. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the transgressions that they lifted up were mostly accurate.
And so many shibboleths that exist about Jews that we've had to live with during our lifetime. I mean, I wrote recently about my first anti-Semitic experience moving from New Jersey to Florida. Was when a young girl in my 4th grade class said, "But you can't be a Jew, you don't have horns." And, you know,
Yeah.
I went home with that one and said, what was she talking about? And my parents did their best to explain that to me. And, you know, that there have been other things.
That's really intense that you had that experience. I learned something about that story about Jews having horns, is that Moses came down from his encounter with God with Karen, like over his head, which can be translated as a halo, but it also is the word for horns. So
it's one of those things that has grown up.
Yeah.
A prejudice that has grown up over eons, unfortunately.
And speaks to why we need to know each other and have relationships, right? Yeah. Because if you know somebody's Jewish, then you're like, oh, they're a person. And it speaks to, I know you've had JCRC guests on your show, but like, you know, if there are listeners who don't have many Jewish people in their community, hopefully they'll bring JCRC.
We've had them frequently. Steve Hunnigs has been a regular guest for years.
Great.
On our show, and we've had you know, rabbis, we've had imams, we've had priests, we have had pastors. In 23 years and 2,300 interviews, we've had them all. And
2,300 interviews?
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's why I'm phasing myself out, and we'll get some new blood in here because it's a long time. I have more rings around my trunk than a sequoia, so I mean, that's one of the things. One of the things you said that I want to pick up on is people think that all Jews know each other. Well, the fact of the matter is that the Jewish religion is very segmented. Probably 50% of it right now, of the people who identify as Jews, have no affiliation with an institution, maybe more than that. But among Jews themselves, I mentioned the fact that there's Orthodox and conservative and Reform. Now, you are a Reconstructionist. What is that?
Reconstructionist is a movement that's uniquely American. It was founded by Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, who taught in the conservative seminary for about 50 years before founding a new movement. Actually, the movement was in the conservative movement for much of the 20th century, and it was progressive. It was inclusive. It was really focused on how Jewish traditions and teachings are relevant for the work of being an American Jew. And what that means has shifted
and
since then.
Humanism
Yes.
Is not unlike that.
For sure not unlike what Mordechai Kaplan taught. He really was...
There's no theology in humanistic Judaism, but the traditions and the history of it are very important and are taught. And there are bar and bat mitzvahs. And in fact, the humanistic congregation here in Minnesota has a rabbi in training, and she will be ordained in about a year. Interesting. But again, a rabbi of a non-theological aspect. And so we don't all know each other.
No, we don't. And by the way, Mordechai Kaplan taught that God was the power that makes for salvation through us and through our actions. So we would look into Torah and look into our prayers, the aspirational teachings, to find what we should aspire to, like visiting the sick or healing or feeding the hungry and celebrating the bride and so on. That myth about Jews not all knowing each other, I just want to add one more piece about it that's very concerning to me right now, is an anti-Semitic strain that seems to be present on campus at the University of Minnesota, that there are pro-Palestinian activists who won't talk to the students at Hillel. This is my understanding, and if I'm wrong, I'm going to apologize. And have made statements like, we won't engage with the Zionist oppressors. So what they're doing is assuming that American Jews are responsible. I mean, we can have a conversation about Israel and if they are Zionist oppressors, but this isn't even that. This is holding American Jews, assuming that they're in relationship or have some say about what is the Israeli government is doing. And it's like, I mean, if you think about, would you go into a Chinese American person and say, you oppress the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, and I'm not going to talk to you. And so those are the kinds of things that smack of anti-Semitism.
There's so much irrationality
Yes.
in terms of the bigotry that is rampant right now, the lack of tolerance. People are less tolerant, I think, than they have ever been. And the fact of the matter is that if you talk to people, you will understand. You can be a Zionist and think that Israel has a right to exist and still not agree with many things that the government and former Netanyahu have done.
That's me.
Which is exactly me also. The fact of the matter is, one thing is nothing to do with the other. And Judaism to me is heritage and some traditions, but to me it's non-theological. To you it's more theological. And
it doesn't have to be, it just happens to be for me.
yeah, and that's what people don't understand also, that the Or Emmett congregation is probably 50% not Jewish because of intermarriage and things like that. So it's an interesting experiment right here in Minnesota that was started by a Reformed rabbi, so about 50 years ago. And, I don't know, but back to, I just pulled this out of the paper today. Anti-Semitic flyers were left on driveways in Texas City where worshipers were held hostage in a synagogue last month. Well, it wasn't just in the Texas City. There were flyers distributed, identical flyers, in about 4 different cities yesterday with some of the Jewish libel in them. And this is not something that happens by accident. This is something that's organized, much the same as we can't say that January 6th was just an accident. That was organized, and it was organized, unfortunately, in large degree by a former president, but who was still kissing Putin's backside, but I won't go into that.
Are you familiar with the Pyramid of Hate?
Not really, no.
It's I think the ADL put it out, but the Anti-Defamation League, but somebody else might have. But it's basically, at the base, it's like, it's making jokes, it's letting things slide that are a little bit offensive, but no big deal. And then it goes up the ladder of things like that, where there's hate flyers, and what happens in a society is a normalization of that, and the peak of the pyramid is genocide, right? Genocide doesn't just happen overnight. And I'm not saying that's the course we're on, but I do feel like the more normalization of such hatred that we have, the more, this is access to democracy, the more our democracy is threatened.
And, beyond that, social media has been very damaging in this regard, because anybody can put anything up there and they can get any number of hits.
It doesn't matter if it's true, right?
Truth has nothing to do with
Right.
it. And
Look at
people,
Putin.
unfortunately, are too lazy to look beyond what they see and research it and find out. So
Yeah, it's
very
super
discouraging
concerning.
to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, but So,
I mean, our tradition has so much to teach about staying in difficult conversations where there's substantive disagreement. And like, as an American and as a Jew, I feel so strongly that we need to work on our skills of doing that, because as you said, we're more and more polarized, we're more and more talking to other people who feel the same way we do. And then there's a chance to otherize and demonize on both sides, and whoever else those other, the really others are out there. But especially with the pandemic too, we haven't had a chance to just be with other people. And that feels like the most important thing right now.
and now with what's happening in the last 3 days, really in Kiev and in the Ukraine, I am old enough to hear the hobnailed boots marching and to remember World War II. I was only a kid, but I saw my family go off to war. And
Were you here?
No, we were in the East at the time. And it's pretty frightening to me to see so much of this coming back now when I thought it was really behind me. And it's very depressing at my age, because it's not me that's going to affect. It's going to be the next generation and the next generation. And
How do you cope with that?
not easily. And I cope with it by writing. I cope with it, fortunately, by getting published fairly frequently. And I cope with it by putting my brain someplace else while I'm creating or trying to create something in a whole new area. Because it can, and I also try to dialogue as much as I can with people who are not Jewish, so that we can have meaningful discussions like this. And one meaningful discussion just came from the control room, which said we have 1 minute left. So
I just want to not add to the polarization, It's like really extreme things sometimes demand a really extreme response, but then we're not lowering the boiling point.
I would like to continue this discussion further someplace down the road a few months from now, but in about 25 seconds, if you have a message from what we've discussed, what is it?
I think that's it. I mean, let's be in conversation. Let's talk to each other.
Tolerance.
Celebration of diversity, not just tolerance, and bringing curiosity, and like wonder, is the fear real? When is the fear real, and when is it just fear of difference? And we can bring curiosity.
Rabbi Debra Rappaport, thank you so much for joining with us today.
Thank you.
And we've got to do this again.
Great.